Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a book haul for the month of April. And this is going to be a very, very large book haul. I brought a lot of books into my library in the month of April. If you follow along, you know, we have been traveling. We were out of town for like all of April, at the end of March, and then all the way through the middle of April. We got home. As I'm filming this yesterday, I'm going to schedule this ahead, so the timing won't line up, but that's fine. But as I'm filming this, we got home last night, and we were in Pullman, Washington for my dog, Jamie. She was being cared for by people at the Vet Med Hospital at WSU. And there is a bookstore in Moscow, Idaho, which is just a short drive away. I got a book from there, but there's also a used bookstore in Pullman that had a lot of really cool stuff. So I came home with a whole pile of books, and then there was mail, book mail that had been delivered. So I have a lot of books that I brought into my library, but I'm really excited about all of them. And one thing that I've really noticed that has happened is that since we redid my library, and I'll put a link to the video down below where we give a tour of the new library, I've really changed the way I think about bringing books into my library and what I want to purchase for my library. I've sort of pivoted a little more away from a sort of instant gratification, this is a new release that I want to read, or this is a book I just found out about that I want to read, and a little bit more into a sort of collectible way of thinking about it. I'm thinking a lot about cool editions of books that I would like to have, authors whose work I would like to have in its entirety, and things like that. And part of it is that I have more space. Part of it is just, I don't know, it's a weird evolution, and I'm gonna have to think about how I handle book haul revisits in the future, because a lot of these books are, say, library builders, things that I want to have in my library and will eventually get to, but I don't have any immediate plans. I'm sort of pivoting away from immediate plans reading to more library builder purchasing. But we're going to talk about the sort of immediate instant gratification books first, and then we'll pivot into the library builders, which I'm really interested to talk about and can't wait to share with you. I think there are some fun finds in here, but we'll start with either newer releases or newer to me books, and things that I actually do kind of have immediate plans to read. And the first one is Arthur and Teddy Are Coming Out by Ryan Love. This is a book that just came out and was released in the UK. I had pre-ordered it because last year someone in the UK told me that they had advanced access to a copy of it. And because I don't live in the UK, I was not able to get advanced access to it. But it did sound like a really interesting book to me. It was recommended to me based on how much I loved The Secret Life of Albert Entwistle by Matt Cain. And it does definitely sound like it's in that vein. And actually recently, as the book has been released, a couple of people have commented again to tell me about it because they know I loved The Secret Life of Albert Entwistle. So this has me even more excited about this book. Now, because I have a lot of books to talk about, I didn't prepare individual blurbs about any of them, so I'm going to read a little bit from the book itself to tell you what they are about. When 79-year-old Arthur Edwards gathers his family together to share some important news, no one is prepared for the bombshell he drops. He's gay, and after a lifetime in the closet, he's finally ready to come out. Arthur's 21-year-old grandson, Teddy, has a secret of his own. He's also gay and developing serious feelings for his colleague, Ben. But Teddy doesn't feel ready to come out yet, especially when Arthur's announcement causes shockwaves in the family. Arthur and Teddy have always been close, and now they must navigate first loves, heartbreak, and their new place in the community. But can they and their family learn to accept who they truly are? I mean, that sounds adorable and heartwarming and kind of sweet, and a lot of stuff that I need in my life right now. You know, it's been a sort of stressful personal life over the last year and a half. I've had one sick dog that we lost last year, and then Jamie was diagnosed with a nasal tumor this year. It's been a lot. So I'm definitely sort of pivoting to that reading that sort of makes you feel valid in a certain way. And this would definitely seem to be in that wheelhouse. I'm really excited about it, and I can't wait to read it. Joel is also very excited about it, so he is probably going to be reading it sometime soon too. If I don't get to it over the next month, it is a shoo-in for my pile of possibilities for Pride Month. In the month of June, I focus on LGBTQ plus reading, and this is a book that I would love to fit in there. I'm hoping to read it very soon. In all of my book hauls, I read a little bit from the opening. because there are a lot of books, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with each one, but we'll do a little bit from each. So Chapter 1, Arthur. Everything looked as perfect as it could for what might be their final family meal together. That's the opening of Arthur and Teddy Are Coming Out by Ryan Love. Really looking forward to that book. Before we left at the end of March, in response to a lot of these movements to access gender-affirming care or to inhibit the legal rights of transgender people in this country, Montana Book Company had a fundraiser where on a certain day, a portion of their sales would go toward transgender charities and fundraisers and legal advocacy and things like that. So there were 2 books that I had been thinking about buying from them on Independent Bookstore Day, and I sort of sped up the process and ordered them from them on that day so that proceeds from the purchase would go toward that charity. And it's just another reason I love Montana Book Company and independent bookstores in general. The first one that I got on that day was Felix Ever After by Kacen Callender. I've been interested in reading this book for a long time and had not gotten around to it. And it just seemed like a good time to sort of pick up a copy, especially since the purpose was to end up donating for charities that would support transgender community. Why not get a book that is kind of in that wheelhouse in the first place? Here's what it is about. Felix Love has never been in love. And yes, he's painfully aware of the irony. He desperately wants to know what it's like and why it seems so easy for everyone but him to find someone. What's worse is that even though he is proud of his identity, Felix also secretly fears that he's one marginalization too many, Black, queer, and transgender, to ever get his own happily ever after. When an anonymous student begins sending him transphobic messages after publicly posting Felix's dead name alongside images of him before he transitioned, Felix comes up with a plan for revenge. What he didn't count on, his catfish scenario landing him in a quasi-love triangle. I've heard a lot of really good things about Kacen Callender's work and about Felix Ever After in particular. Really looking forward to it. Again, if I don't manage to read this over the next month, which is very likely, this would be a shoo-in for my pile of possibilities for Pride Month. Let's do a quick bit from the opening of this book. Chapter 1. We push open the apartment's building's glass door out into the yellow sunshine that's a little too cheerful and bright. It's hot as hell, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin, your hair, your freaking eyeballs. That's the opening of Felix Ever After by Kacen Callender. The other book that I got from Montana Book Company was My Government Means to Kill Me by Rasheed Newson. This is a book I've really had my eyes on for a long time, and I want to read the physical version because I have access to the audio. But this is a book that has footnotes, and I really wanted to make sure I have... Audio sometimes skips footnotes. You can see there's one right there. So I figured I really wanted to have a copy of the book, and I was waiting for a moment to buy it. Originally, I was going to wait for Independent Bookstore Day, but when their charity came up, I decided to jump on a copy. I'm really looking forward to reading this book. I have a 5-star prediction on this book. I just feel like it's exactly the wheelhouse of things that I like and respond to, so it seems perfect for me. I also mentioned it in my video about potential Pulitzer Prize winners. I'll link that down below as well. We'll see what happens with that. Here is what they say about it on the book. Born into a wealthy Black Indianapolis family, Earl Trey Singleton III leaves his overbearing parents and their expectations behind by running away to New York City with only a few dollars in his pocket. In the city, Trey meets up with a cast of characters that changes his life forever. He volunteers at a renegade home hospice for AIDS patients and, after being put to the test by gay rights activists, becomes a member of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP. Along the way, Trey attempts to navigate past traumas and searches for ways to maintain familial relationships, all while seeking the meaning of life amid so much death. Vibrant, humorous, and fraught with entanglements, Rasheed Newson's My Government Means to Kill Me is an exhilarating, fast-paced coming-of-age story that lends itself to a larger discussion about what it means for a young gay Black man in the mid-1980s to come to terms with his role in the midst of a political and social reckoning. I really want to read this book so badly, so this is something that would go to the front of my pile of possibilities for Pride Month if I don't manage to read it over the next month and a half before Pride Month begins, because I really want to read this book. And again, it's a 5-star prediction for me. I have really high hopes, and hopefully that doesn't end up hurting the book itself. Lesson number 1, The Boss Doesn't Love You. It is true that before moving to New York City in May of 1985, I turned my back on a 6-figure trust fund. I was 17 and I wanted to be able to lay sole claim to my successes and failures. My parents considered me foolish, stubborn, and worse yet, ungrateful. You'll regret it, my mother told me. Yet I didn't miss the money. At first. And that is the opening of My Government Needs to Kill Me by Rasheed Newson. I'm really looking forward to that book. Then we have Nettleblack by Nat Reeve. This is something I had ordered from the UK. I heard Books and Bow talk about this a while ago on their channel, and it just sounded really interesting and kind of fun and quirky. Quirky books can be a bit of a tough sell for me lately, but this just sounded... There's a line in the description of it that kind of perfectly encapsulates why it really sounded interesting to me. 1893. Henry Nettleblack has to act fast or she'll be married off by her elder sister. But leaving the safety of her wealthy life isn't as simple as she thought. Ambushed, robbed, and then saved by a mysterious organization, part detective agency, part neighborhood watch, a desperate Henry disguises herself and enlists. Sent out to investigate a string of crimes, she soon realizes that she's living in a small rural town with surprisingly big problems. When the net starts to close around Henry and sinister forces threaten to expose her as the missing Nettleblack sister, the new people in her life seem to offer her a way out and a way forward. Is the world she's lost in also a place she can find herself? Told through journal entries and letters, Nettleblack is a subversive and playful ride through the perils and joys of finding your place in the world, challenging myths about queerness, particularly transness, as a modern phenomenon while exploring the practicalities of articulating queer perspectives when you're struggling for words. It's that last line that really sold me hard on this book and made me want to read it. So here it is. It's a bit of a chunkster, but I think it'll be a kind of fun read. There is tiny print. There's a very large cast of characters in the beginning, and I haven't read a book like that in a while. There is also a map, and if you follow along, you know I love a book with a map. So that also has me pretty excited about this book. Let's see. So again, because this is told through like journal entries and things like that, the beginning is a little off the beaten path. Chapter 1, in which some strange decisions are made on my behalf. Nettleblack's tincture, a blessing to the mildly unwell, sold and posted everywhere in 3 and 4 half-inch decorative bottles. And it kind of goes on, like a label for the product. And then it goes into an excerpt from the Last Will and Testament of Morgan Nettleblack. And then the novel spins out from there. Should be a very interesting read. A little difficult to summarize in a book haul like this, but should be a very interesting read as well. The final of the sort of newer books that I got is The Last Cold Place, a field season studying penguins in Antarctica by Maria de Gracia. I actually won a copy of this on Instagram from Scribner, so thank you to Scribner for sending this to me. It sounds really interesting. Obviously, because I won it, it's not something I went out and purchased for myself, so there isn't as much of an urgency to read it anytime soon. However, it sounds adorable. It is a fascinating memoir about a young scientist studying penguins in Antarctica, a first-hand account of this beautiful, brutal, and remote climate, the impact of climate change on the animals that live in Antarctica, and the challenges of field work, all of which sounds fascinating to me. And you also can argue with a free book. Chapter 1 is called Mid-October. In the morning of October 27, 2016, our inflatable dinghy cut through frigid waters toward the northern shores of Livingston Island. It was the first land I'd seen since we passed the last southern islands of South America 5 days earlier. And that is the opening of The Last Cold Place, a field season studying penguins in Antarctica by Naira de Gracia. Now we get into the big pile of books. And the first one is a success story because I'm already halfway done reading it. The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street by Helene Hanff. One of the books I went into the used bookstore in Pullman looking for was a copy of 84 Charing Cross Road, which I read this year and loved. And I really want to have a copy, and I want to get a used copy of it because there's a line in the book where Helene Hanff talks about used books and the sort of sense of connection and history with the person who owned the book before you and all of that. So I feel like a used book is the way to go. They didn't have a copy of 84 Charing Cross Road. They did have a copy of The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street. And I am halfway through reading it. The only reason I'm not done, because this is a tiny little thing, you could dunk it in your coffee, is just that reading has been a little bit difficult with everything going on lately. I'm sure you can understand. Ordinarily, this would be something I would have finished in a single afternoon, but I just, and part of why I haven't picked it up since the first day that I picked it up is that I know once I do, I'm going to need to finish it. So it's not something I can when I'm exhausted, going to bed at the end of the day, I don't want to pick it up, because then it'll create that sense of frustration where I either need to decide to stay up and finish it, or I'm going to be just reading a chunk of it. So I'm almost done reading it, and I'm really enjoying it. So in 84 Charing Cross Road, Helene Hanff develops correspondence with people at Marks & Co. booksellers in the UK, although she lives in New York. She desperately wants to go to London. And over the next 20 years, she continues that correspondence and develops friendships with the people at Marks & Co., but does not make it to London. Every time she makes plans to come, something ends up getting in the way, and her trip ends up getting canceled. After 84 Charing Cross Road is published in the United States, a publisher in the UK buys the rights and is going to release a version over there, and they invite her over to do publicity for the book. So this is her journal of that trip, where she finally gets to go to London after a lifetime of wanting to go, and it's a really great book. I would highly recommend it, especially if you are a fan of 84 Charing Cross Road and have not already read it. Up, Up, and Away is the first section of it, and here is how it begins. Theoretically, it was one of the happiest days of my life. The date was Thursday, June 17, 1971. The BOAC lifted from Kennedy Airport promptly at 10 a.m. The sky was blue and sunny, and after a lifetime of waiting, I was finally on my way to London. And that is how The Duchess of Bloomsbury Street begins. Almost done with it. Can't wait to finish, and I really look forward to completing it. That is the first thing I got from the used bookstore. Everything else is a fun discovery. So this is one of those bookstores where there are piles of books in the aisles, and there are books just crammed onto every shelf. You really need to spend a lot of time digging through, and I love that experience. I know it can be frustrating for a lot of people, but this is a store that it is organized by section, and within the section it is organized. And actually, one of the days when I really spent a lot of time there, they had an employee going through and alphabetizing the literature section. So I spent a lot of time going through and just finding things, and then we kind of came back, and I had been thinking about some of them, and I ended up purchasing a lot of them. So if you follow along, you know I'm working on a Pulitzer Prize project. I am trying to read every book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And I decided along the way that I wanted to own a copy of every book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I completed that mission this month, and will be getting to the book that completed that mission toward the end. But even though I already own a copy of every book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, I still think fun editions of books are appealing and really interesting to me. So I bought something I already own a copy of. It's The Late George Apley by John P. Marquand. This is a novel in the form of a memoir. It's one of the really early Pulitzer Prize winners. And it's a beautiful pocket edition of the paperback. This is not an edition that you can read. And it is not, because I don't want to spend a lot of time flipping through it, but it's tiny print on kind of flimsy pages, and the spine is not something I would want to subject to a lot of reading. But one interesting thing about it has this logo inside. That banner says, "Books are weapons in the war of ideas," which I love. And it has a note that this is a wartime book that was built or created in compliance with regulations for conservation of paper during the war, which is also really interesting. So just a fun edition of a book to have. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it since I already own a copy of it. But basically, this is a story of 3 generations of men in the Apley family, and the father has recently died. So it's sort of a story about societal change and things like that, which early Pulitzer was very concerned with. I'm really looking forward to giving it a try. The beginning of it is a foreword and apology. George William Apley was born in the house of his maternal grandfather, William Leeds Hancock, in the steeper part of Mount Vernon Street on Beacon Hill on January 25th, 1866. He died in his own house, which overlooks the Charles River Basin and the Esplanade on the water side of Beacon Street on December 13, 1933. This was the frame in which his life moved, and the frame which will surround his portrait as a man. He once said of himself, "I am the sort of man I am because environment prevented me being anything else." That is the opening of The Late George Apley by John P. Marquand. Again, I already own a copy of this book. However, just a really fun edition of it to have on my shelf. And I'd never seen another book by John P. Marquand, but they had one on the shelf. And it's one of those things where you kind of wonder, is this going to be racist? It probably will be racist. It's Last Laugh, Mr. Moto by John P. Marquand. So he wrote a series of sort of action books that follow this Mr. Moto character. And in this one, a tiny Caribbean island that should be a tropic paradise is turned into a hell of intrigue, violence, murder, and deception as 5 people of as many nations, 4 desperate men, and 1 beautiful, mysterious woman come together with the lives of all of them and the fates of millions more at stake. I don't know if I will read this as part of my Pulitzer Prize project, but I just think it's interesting to have another book that he wrote. And the question of how well this aged would be interesting to sort of see. Chapter 1 begins, when Robert Bowles tried to put all the events in order, his mind would keep going back to Mercator Island, although he knew that Mercator Island was nearer the end than the beginning. That is the opening of Last Laugh, Mr. Moto by John P. Marquand, who won a Pulitzer for the last book we talked about, but this definitely does not seem in that wheelhouse at all. Shirley Ann Grau won a Pulitzer Prize in the 1960s for a book called The Keepers of the House, which is about an old Southern family and their home and the sort of secrets that have been keeping the family together or threatening to tear them apart. She's another author that I think there are a lot of people who have held on to The Keepers of the House. That is a book that is still in print and was recently reissued. But I haven't ever seen anything else by her. And I have a bit of an affinity for these sort of vintage jackets, and it goes right into that. This is The Hard Blue Sky, and here's what it says. In The Hard Blue Sky, Miss Grau opens up a new and little-known world. She penetrates the heart of a small, windswept island off the Louisiana coast and captures the mood and rhythm of the life of the people who have for generations hung onto this narrow strip of land on the edge of nowhere. And again, when I do get around to reading The Keepers of the House as part of my project, I don't know that I will read this as well, but I just really, as part of this project, I'm developing an affinity, especially for the forgotten authors who have won Pulitzer Prizes or the lesser known ones. And John P. Marquand is that for sure. Shirley Ann Grau to a lesser extent because her book is still in print and something that people talk about to a degree. But definitely her other work is more or less known. So it'll just be fun for me to have this on my shelf as well. And who knows, maybe I'll read it. Maybe at some point I won't. An author who is certainly more forgotten than Shirley Ann Grau is Edwin O'Connor. He won a Pulitzer Prize for a novel called The Edge of Sadness, which is definitely a sort of forgotten novel. He is a sort of forgotten author, and it'll be interesting to have. Again, I'm really developing an affinity in particular for the authors who are there to be rediscovered on the list of Pulitzer Prize winners. And I've never seen another book of his, so I sort of jumped at the opportunity to grab one. Between the potato famine in 1847 and 1900, 4.5 million Irish crowded into our American cities. They were segregated into tenement districts, persecuted at first on religious grounds, and cold-shouldered socially by the Yankee majority. Politics, especially ward politics, was the only ladder by which they could climb out of the slum. They seized it, and in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, to name but 3, the City Hall became the objective of every bright young talent in the second and third generations. The Last Hurrah is their story, written with true sympathy and warm, impulsive humor in a novel as delightful as it is profoundly moving. From various angles, through various eyes, one gradually discovers a great deal about Irish life and politics in America, about loyalty and hatred, about the evolution of a big city, about what makes a follower and makes a leader. Frank Skeffington, the hero of Edwin O'Connor's Atlantic Prize novel, has been immersed in politics for 50 years, and for 40 of those years, he was dominant in this city. He emerges as a magnetic figure, half hero, half rascal, a legend in his own time, but known intimately only to a few. Politics was Frank Skeffington's life. It placed him in a paternalistic relationship with the Irish poor. It involved him in a rivalry with the city financiers and in a bitter feud with the opposition papers. It brought him up against the antagonism of the Italian contractors and exposed him to the lifelong hatred of the cardinal, since Skeffington never hesitated to use the church for his advantage. That's The Last Hurrah. Here is a photo of Edwin O'Connor on the back of the book, and let's do a quick read from the beginning. Chapter 1. It was early in August when Frank Skeffington decided, or rather announced his decision, which actually had been arrived at some months before, to run for re-election as mayor of the city. This was a matter about which there had been public speculation for a good while, for in fact 4 years, ever since he had been inaugurated for what his opponents had fondly hoped was the last time. That is the opening of The Last Hurrah by Edwin O'Connor, a Pulitzer Prize winner who is fairly little known by now. Then we have Goodbye to Berlin by Christopher Isherwood. This is a rather stunning Folio Society edition of the book. I really couldn't pass up. I actually have a copy of The Berlin Stories by Christopher Isherwood, which includes everything that's in here and The Last of Mrs. Norris, which is a novella, I believe. So I kind of already owned a copy of it. However, this is just a really gorgeous edition of it. And The Berlin Stories inspired the musical Cabaret. It originally inspired a play, and then the musical Cabaret was inspired, and the movie Cabaret came around, and this is what began all of that. I read it. I remember liking it. I felt sort of emotionally distant to it. It didn't quite compare to Cabaret to me. However, it is a source of fascination, and this is just a really gorgeous edition of it. I believe there would originally have been a slipcover for this, and they didn't have it, but that's fine. It's in really good condition, and I really just wasn't going to pass that up. And it is also illustrated by George Grows, and there are illustrations throughout the book. Let me see if I can find another one. Really fun edition of this book, isn't it? Quite a find. I'm really glad I managed to pick it up before somebody else grabbed it. Part 1, A Berlin Diary. From my window, the deep, solemn, massive street. Cellar shops where the lamps burn all day, under the shadow of top-heavy balconied facades, dirty plaster frontages embossed with scrollwork and heraldic devices. The whole district is like this, street leading into the street of houses like shabby monumental safes, crammed with the tarnished valuables and second-hand furniture of a bankrupt middle class. That is Goodbye to Berlin by Christopher Isherwood, which has also been compiled as The Berlin Stories. And really excited to have this edition of it. Again, I've already read it, so little bonus there. It's just an interesting edition of it to have for my shelves. That collectible part of what I was talking about earlier. It's just a nice edition of a book that I find particularly fascinating. And then we have Travels with Charley, In Search of America by John Steinbeck. This is a book I've heard a lot about and been sort of curious about, and I just really couldn't pass up this really beautiful hardcover edition with this amazing illustration of Charley. This is sort of about John Steinbeck traveling with his dog. And I mean, come on. It also has... I'm going to be very careful removing the cover for a moment so I can show you the map on the inside flaps and the jacket of the book itself. Here is that map. Again, I love a book with a map, and this is a really particularly beautiful one. And look at that. There is Charley again. Now, I'm going to be careful putting this back on for a moment, so bear with me because I'm not going to damage this book. And here's a photo of John Steinbeck and Charley right there. All right, so 20 years in the 20th century are a long time, and for 20 years, John Steinbeck has been occupied in writing about America while America changed. He felt that he might have lost touch with this monster country, with its speech, the smell of its grass and trees, its color and quality of light, the pulse of its people. To reassure himself, he set out on a voyage of rediscovery, accompanied by a distinguished French poodle named Charley, and riding in a 3/4-ton pickup truck equipped with miniature ship's cabin and named Rocinante. His course took him through almost 40 states, northward from Long Island to Maine, through the Middle West to Chicago, onward by way of Minnesota, North Dakota, and Montana, which he fell in love with, and Idaho to Seattle, south to San Francisco and his birthplace, Salinas, eastward through the Mojave, New Mexico, Arizona, and to the vast hospitality of Texas, to New Orleans, and a shocking drama of desegregation, finally on the last leg through Alabama, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey to New York. All of which sounds really interesting. So again, this is a book I've been interested in for a really long time. I didn't have immediate plans to purchase a copy or read it or get a copy, but I couldn't pass up this edition of this book. Chapter 1. When I was very young and the urge to be someplace else was on me, I was assured by mature people that maturity would cure this itch. When years described me as mature, the remedy prescribed was middle age. In middle age, I was assured that greater age would calm my fever, and now that I am 58, perhaps senility will do the job. Nothing has worked. That's the opening of Travels with Charley in Search of America by John Steinbeck. I really just love this edition of this book. It's, again, appeals to that collector's instinct in me that has really been brought out by the new library. Then we have Yellow Sun, Bright Sky, the Indian Country Stories of Oliver Lafarge. Oliver Lafarge won one of the early Pulitzer Prizes for fiction. He was a sort of anthropologist, and he wrote a novel about Native American life in this country, and these short stories kind of go in with that. And again, I had just never seen anything else by him, so I was not going to pass up the opportunity to pick this up. And I think this would definitely be an interesting companion to the book that he won a Pulitzer Prize for. Laughing Boy is the one that he won the Pulitzer Prize for. And these just show the breadth and variety of Native American life in this country, from the perspective of white characters, but also from Native characters as well. There's a photo of Oliver Lafarge right there. And I think this will be a fascinating book to explore as well. The first story in this collection is called North is Black. It is true that we say that North is black and cold and bad because of the stories of our old men, but those are good stories. They had them from the old men before them, from the time that there were no Americans. The Navajo have been here ever since the land was made. The Americans are new. And I believe Oliver Lafarge is a white man, but he was writing in a time where a Native author would have had a very difficult time not only getting published, but being recognized. So he was sort of bringing attention to Native Americans and what their lives and histories were before it was possible for a Native author to be more widely known. So he did sort of open the door, but that's my quick view of it. It'll be really interesting to dig in a little further once I start thinking about reading his book for my Pulitzer Prize project. I mentioned that part of this collector's instinct is that there are certain authors that I have decided I would like to own every book that they have published, and Toni Morrison is one of them. I'm working on my collection. It's this next to Night Crawling by Layla Motley right there. I'm working on that one a little slowly because usually my local used bookstore is out of copies of her book very quickly when they come in. But I found a copy of Jazz, and I don't remember. I don't think this is a first edition because I think the actual first edition was done by the Franklin Library. They would arrange deals with publishers where they would do the first edition. So this is the first commercial edition of the book, is how that works. And this is an interesting book as well because it's sort of in a trilogy with Beloved, which is the book that she won a Pulitzer Prize for. In the afterglow of a clean triumph, her widely celebrated Pulitzer Prize-winning bestseller, Beloved, Toni Morrison moves to even higher ground. This, her eagerly awaited new novel, Jazz, is spellbinding for the haunting passion of its profound love story and for the bittersweet lyricism and refined sensuality of its powerful and elegant style. It is winter, barely 3 days into 1926, 7 years after Armistice. We are in the scintillating city around Lenox Avenue, when all the wars are over and there will never be another one. At last, everything's ahead. Here comes the new, look out. There goes the sad stuff, the bad stuff, the things nobody could help stuff. But amid the euphoric decisiveness, a tragedy ensues among people who had train danced into the city, from points south and west in search of promise. Joe Trace, in his 50s, door-to-door salesman of Cleopatra beauty products, erstwhile devoted husband, shoots to death his lover of 3 months, impetuous, 18-year-old Dorcas. At the funeral, his determined, hard-working wife, Violet, herself a hairdresser, who is given to stumbling into dark mental cracks and who talks mostly to birds, tries with a knife to disfigure the corpse. In a dazzling act of jazz-like improvisation, moving seamlessly in and out of the past, present, and future, a mysterious voice, whose identity is a matter of each reader's imagination, weaves this brilliant fiction at the same time showing how its blues are informed by the brutal exigencies of slavery. Richly combining history, legend, and reminiscence, this voice captures as never before the ineffable mood, the complex humanity of black urban life at a moment in our century where we assumed we understood. I love Toni Morrison. I've really enjoyed exploring her work, and I am looking forward to reading this one at some point as well. I think I want to read Sula next, but Jazz is up there pretty high on my list of ones to get to. I know that woman. She used to live with a flock of birds on Lenox Avenue. Know her husband, too. He fell for an 18-year-old girl with one of those deep-down spooky loves that made him so sad and happy he shot her just to keep the feeling going. And that is the opening of Jazz by the great Toni Morrison, one of my favorite authors for sure. Now, I have a paperback copy of The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, but I've been kind of wanting a nicer edition. And they had this really fun one that is stamped for the Hemingway house in Key West, which I have been outside but never in. And I don't know. I thought it would be a nice addition to have, since I want a nicer one than the paperback that I have. So I have a copy I can read, and now just a fun one for display purposes. The last novel Ernest Hemingway saw published, The Old Man and the Sea, has proved itself to be one of the enduring works of American fiction. It is the story of an old Cuban fisherman and his supreme ordeal, a relentless, agonizing battle with a giant marlin far out in the Gulf Stream. Using the simple, powerful language of a fable, Hemingway takes the timeless themes of courage in the face of defeat and personal triumph won from loss and transforms them into a magnificent 20th century classic. I have not read this one yet, and I do look forward to getting to it. It's a tiny little book, so it should be fairly easy to get to at some point, whenever I have time. Here is the illustration that opens the book. He was an old man who fished alone in a skiff in the Gulf Stream, and he had gone 84 days now without taking a fish. In the first 40 days, a boy had been with him, but after 40 days without a fish, the boy's parents had told him that the old man was now definitely and finally Salau, which is the worst form of unlucky, and the boy had gone at their orders in another boat, which caught 3 good fish the first week. It made the boy sad to see the old man come in each day with his skiff empty, and he always went down to help him carry either the coiled lines or the gaff and harpoon and the sail that was furled around the mast. The sail was patched with flour sacks and furled. It looked like the flag of permanent defeat. That is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. We're getting there. One of Ours by Willa Cather is a book I already own, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but it is the book she won a Pulitzer Prize for. I have a Franklin Library edition, so this is a copy that I can actually read when I get around to it, and it is very visually striking. It's a Dover edition of the book. It leaves the frontier and it talks a little bit about World War I, so it's a bit different from Willa Cather's other works, and it is one that I'm really excited about reading at some point. I might try to read it this year because it is the book that won a Pulitzer 100 years ago this year, so there's a sort of interesting chronological angle to it. Book 1, On Lovely Creek. Claude Wheeler opened his eyes before the sun was up and vigorously shook his younger brother, who lay in the other half of the same bed. Ralph, get awake. Come down and help me wash the car." "What for?" "Why, aren't we going to the circus today?" And that is the opening of One of Ours by Willa Cather. All right, that takes us to The Beautiful Room is Empty by Edmund White. Edmund White is a legendary queer author. This is the second installment of a trilogy of books following an unnamed narrator throughout his life. The first one is A Boy's Own Story. I have a copy of that on my shelf. I had been sort of planning to read that one before deciding if I wanted to continue with the rest of the trilogy, but I'm not going to pass up an opportunity to get a nice edition of the book, which I found in that used bookstore in Pullman. And I really need to read an Edmund White book. I have not yet, and hopefully this is going to be a bit of a kick in the pants to finally get around to. I have a memoir that he wrote about New York City in the 1970s and A Boy's Own Story, and hopefully this will give me a kick in the pants to get to either of those. When the narrator of Edmund White's poised yet scalding autobiographical novel first embarks on his sexual odyssey, it is the 1950s, and America is a big gray country of families and drowsy holiday. That country has no room for a scholarly teenager with guilty but insatiable stirrings toward other men. Yet even as he launches himself into the arena of homosexual eros, White's protagonist is also finding his way into the larger world. Moving from a Midwestern college to the Stonewall Tavern and then on the night of the first gay uprising, and populated by eloquent queens, butch posers, and a fearfully incompetent shrink, The Beautiful Room is Empty conflates the acts of coming out and coming of age. The result is a masterly picaresque, by turns furious, gleeful, and poetic, and bristling with epigrammatic wit on every page. Edmund White is definitely an author I need to get around to trying at some point. Here we go. Chapter 1. I met Maria during my next to last year in prep school. She was studying painting at the art academy just across the street from my school, Eton, and she was 7 years older than I, but she scarcely seemed to notice the difference. That's the opening of The Beautiful Room is Empty by Edmund White. All right, the last one before we get into the final part of this book haul is The Sheltered Life. Ellen Glasgow won a Pulitzer Prize for a novel called In This Our Life, which was also adapted into a movie. So I didn't get this one at first. And as I was thinking about it later, I looked up Ellen Glasgow, and she is a Southern writer who was compared to Faulkner and a lot of other Southern writers in the beginning of the century. And she faded away more than them. But because of the comparisons, I was really curious and I loved the idea of having another book of hers around. And this is one that people point to as one of her great works. So it seemed like a match. So I went back and I picked it up. Acclaimed as Ellen Glasgow's tour de force, The Sheltered Life stands as one of the most stirring epitaphs to the Romantic South in American literature. In the town of Queenborough, Virginia, the Archbalds and the Birdsongs, the two remaining families on Washington Street, hold their ground and attempt to ignore the industrial invasion in the years before the First World War. Told from two perspectives, the wise outlook of elderly General Archbald, a civilized man in an uncivilized world, and the romantic vantage point of Jenny Blair, his impetuous grandchild, the story is a vivid parable of a society in decline. Unaware of the disaster unfolding around them, the two households cling blindly to a dream that has died, as the crumbling of their shelters, religion, convention, and social prejudice gradually destroys the fragile order of their lives. This was first published in 1938. Chapter 1. By the open French window of the dining room, Jenny Blair Archbald was reading Little Women for the assured reward of a penny a page. Now and then she would stop to shake her head, toss her smooth, honey-colored plaits over her shoulders, and screw her face into a caricature of Aunt Etta's expression. It isn't safe to skip, she thought. Grandfather would be sure to find out. And that is the opening of The Sheltered Life by Ellen Glasgow. So the final books that I brought into my library are all Louise Erdrich books. Louise Erdrich, like Toni Morrison, is an author. I would like to have all of their books and maybe someday read all of their books. And I think it would be a fun, if difficult, and time-consuming project to read all of Louise Erdrich's books leading up to The Night Watchman, which is the book she won the Pulitzer Prize for. And this was the last Pulitzer Prize book that I did not own. I got a copy at Book People of Moscow in Moscow, Idaho, which is a short drive from Pullman, Washington, where we were staying. So this would be sort of the culmination. I think that would be an interesting way of approaching, because I think it's safe to say that Louise Erdrich had a legacy Pulitzer Prize. It was sort of a lifetime achievement, recognition for all of the work that she has done in her career. Maybe not necessarily a prize for The Night Watchman itself. Thomas Wajcik is the night watchman at the jewel-bearing plant near the Turtle Mountain Reservation in rural North Dakota. He is also a Chippewa council member who is trying to understand the consequences of a new emancipation bill in the United States Congress. It is 1953, and he and the other council members know the bill is not about freedom. It is a termination that threatens the rights of Native Americans to their land and their very identity. Since graduating from high school, Pixie Parento has insisted that everyone call her Patrice. She works at the plant in a job that pays barely enough to support her mother and younger brother. Determined to find her beloved older sister Vera and her child who have disappeared, Patrice makes a fateful trip to Minneapolis that introduces her to unexpected forms of exploitation and violence that endanger her life. Based on the extraordinary life of Louise Erdrich's grandfather, Patrick Garneau, who carried the fight against native dispossession from rural North Dakota to Washington, D.C., The Night Watchman is a majestic work of fiction from one of the most acclaimed writers of our time. So definitely a work of political importance. I read it, I listened to it on audio when it was first released, and I thought it was a little too fragmented. There were parts of the story that I liked and parts that I didn't, and that's a bit unfortunate, but it will be an interesting way of approaching a Pulitzer conversation for Louise Erdrich. The beginning of the book is Thomas Wajcik removed his thermos from his armpit and set it on the steel desk alongside his scuffed briefcase. His work jacket went on the chair, his lunchbox on the cold windowsill. When he took off his padded tractor hat, a crab apple fell from the ear flap, a gift from his daughter Fee. He caught the apple and put it out on the desktop to admire. Then punched his time card. Midnight. He picked up the keyring, a company flashlight, and walked the perimeter of the main floor. That is the opening of The Night Watchman by Louise Erdrich, the last Pulitzer Prize book that I needed to purchase in order to have a full set. I got 3 other Louise Erdrich books, including Four Souls. This was something I got from the used bookstore in Pullman. This is actually a first edition of it. In this book, a strange and compelling unkillable woman decides to leave home and the story begins. Fleur Pillager takes her mother's name, Four Souls, for strength and walks from her Ojibwe reservation to the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. She is seeking restitution from and revenge on the lumber baron who has stripped her reservation, but revenge is never simple, and she quickly finds her intentions complicated by her own dangerous compassion for the man who wronged her. And the book begins with a family tree, because a lot of hers do. A lot of Louise Erdrich's books are connected, which is why it would be so interesting to work up to The Night Watchman. 1. The roads, Nanapush. Fleur took the small roads, the rutted paths through the woods, traversing slough edge and heavy underbrush, trackless, unmapped, unknown, and always bearing east. That is Four Souls by Louise Erdrich. Then I got The Crown of Columbus, which is a novel that she did in collaboration with Michael Doris, who was her husband at the time. He was a very troubled man, and the story of their marriage is sad and difficult, and would be an interesting addendum to a Louise Erdrich project. So they had a copy and I hadn't seen it anywhere else, so I made sure I grabbed it. In their only fully collaborative literary work, Louise Erdrich and Michael Doris have written a gripping novel of history, suspense, recovery, and new beginnings. The Crown of Columbus chronicles the adventures of a pair of mismatched lovers, Vivian Two-Star, a divorced pregnant anthropologist, and Roger Williams, a consummate academic, epic poet, and bewildered father of Vivian's baby, on their quest for the truth about Christopher Columbus and themselves. When Vivian uncovers what is presumed to be the lost diary of Christopher Columbus, she and Roger are drawn into a journey from icy New Hampshire to the idyllic Caribbean in search of the greatest treasure of Europe. Which sounds a little wild. Could be interesting. It definitely sounds different from any other Louise Erdrich book, which makes sense since it is something that she wrote with someone else. It begins. In the warm pink gold of a Caribbean afternoon, something marvelous washed up from the sea. The island girl who found it, Valerie Clock, was known as a good-for-nothing child, the type who lazed about when her mother sent her down to rake the beach. Soon, everything would change. And that is from the opening of The Crown of Columbus, a novel written in collaboration with Louise Erdrich and Michael Doris. The final book for this massive book haul is The Last Report on the Miracles at Little No Horse, again by Louise Erdrich. There was this really great hardcover edition of it. I actually found this online and ordered it used from there. And it is now part of my collection. And you can see a family tree on the inside flaps of it. For more than half a century, Father Damien Modeste has served his beloved people, the Ojibwe, on the remote reservation of Little No Horse. Compelled to his task by a direct mystical experience, Father Damien has made enormous sacrifices and experienced the joys of commitment as well as deep suffering. Now nearing the end of his life, Father Damien dreads the discovery of his physical identity, for he is a woman who has lived as a man. He imagines the undoing of all that he has accomplished, sees unions unsundered, baptisms nullified, those who confessed to him once again unforgiven. To complicate his fears, his quiet life changes when a troubled colleague comes to the reservation to investigate the life of the perplexing, difficult, possibly false saint, Sister Leopolda. Father Damien alone knows the strange truth of Sister Leopolda's piety, but these facts are bound up in his own secret. In relating his history and that of Leopolda, whose wonder-working is documented but inspired, he believes, by a capacity for evil rather than the love of good, Father Damien is forced to choose. Should he reveal all he knows and risk everything, or should he manufacture a protective history? In spinning out the tale of his life, Father Damien, in fact, does both. Which sounds fascinating, and I think you could probably agree. Prologue, The Old Priest, 1996. The grass was white with frost on the shadowed sides of the reservation hills and ditches, but the morning air was almost warm, sweetened by a southern wind. Father Damien's best hours were late at night and just after rising, when all he had to break his fast was a cup of hot water. He was old, very old, but alert until he had to eat. Dressed in his antique cassock, he sat in his favorite chair, contemplated the graveyard that spread just behind his retirement house and up a low hill. His thoughts seemed to penetrate the sheer air, the maze of tree branches waving above the stones, clouds, sky, even time itself, and they surged from his brain, tense quickly, one on the next, until he'd eaten his tiny meal of toast and coffee. Just after, Father Damien's mind relaxed. His habit was then to doze again, often straight into his afternoon nap. That is the beginning of The Last Report on the Miracles at Little No Horse by Louise Erdrich. And those are the many, 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 many books that I brought into my library in the month of April. It's a lot. I would appreciate any feedback you have about these books, recommendations you have based on these books, just thoughts in general about libraries, book collecting, and all of that stuff in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.